Isn't it weird how ready and willing people are to call for boycotts of Western enemy countries or states who they see as like foreign and bad, etc. For example, Arabic countries, Muslim majority countries, etc., and then not apply even remotely those same sorts of standards to their own countries. It's pretty interesting when you look at like the incredibly massive action that has been taken against Russia since their invasion of Ukraine, for example. Russian sporting teams have been banned from like everything. Russian athletes have been banned from like everything. It's like random Google headlines here that you can see. Russian companies banned from everywhere. Like there's also obviously the massive sanctions on Russia, stuff like that. Oh yeah, countries imposing travel bans on Russian citizens. Like look at this article right here from Al Jazeera. Should the EU impose a travel ban on all Russians? This person says it's very important that Russian citizens feel the burden and real consequences of this war. Could you imagine these people saying any of this about the West? It's very important that France and the US feel the burden and the real consequences of their bombing and destruction of Libya. It's very important that American citizens feel the burden and the real consequences for their disgusting invasion of Iraq. It's very important that they feel the same for Afghanistan, for their support of the Saudi war in Yemen. Could you ever imagine any of these people saying that? Where were the calls for boycotts, sanctions, bans, or anything against the USA? The World Cup being in Qatar is a fucking joke. It's obviously just because FIFA officials got bribed. But where's the same energy for not holding a sporting event in Qatar, or for example, for calling for the exclusion of the Iranian national football team from the tournament, where there is, for example, the US, which is literally hosting the next World Cup in 2026. Why would you hold it there? Okay, you don't want it to be held in Qatar because awful workers' rights in which plenty of people have died and being incredibly rabidly homophobic to a violent degree. Okay, now, the US is incredibly racist to a violent degree. The US mass murders black people for the smallest offense. The US has more than 1 million ethnic minorities in prison on an explicitly ethnic basis, obviously. And that's just domestically. We're not even getting into the absolute destruction that the US brings upon the rest of the world. Not just direct through its wars, but even more indirectly through its economic impositions that force millions upon millions of people into poverty, kill them in many cases. Right fucking now, the EU and US are imposing absolutely brutal sanctions on Cuba. Well, not the EU on Cuba, but on Venezuela. Yes, on Syria, on Yemen, trying to do everything they possibly can to hurt the people there. Qatar is a fucking awful country, but it's an awful country of about 3 million people. Qatar couldn't hope to do as much harm as the US is doing, even if it wanted to. Yet no one's talking about boycotting the US. No one's talking about banning the US national team from any sporting events. No one's talking about sanctioning the US. No one's talking about, as Natia Seskuria said here about Russians, that it's very important that American citizens feel the burden and the real consequences of this war. And yeah, that's another thing that they're not mentioning. Qatar is literally just a US satellite state. The only reason that Qatar can fucking exist is because of US support. All of the Gulf monarchies, the Gulf oil monarchies, they are there because the US took over as their patron from the British Empire. They exist because of the US. So if you want to get to the root of the problem, you go to the US. But of course, no. And this is basically the best example you will ever see of the fact that Western imperialists don't actually give a shit about anything that they claim to care about because they don't apply it to themselves. They don't apply it to themselves. They don't apply it to their allies. They don't apply it to, the other countries who they consider to be an integral part of the superior Western race, we might as well say at this point. That's what it really is. They don't give a fucking shit about homophobia. They don't give a fucking shit about atrocities. They don't give a shit about any of that. They don't give a shit about war. If they cared about any of that, they would be calling for themselves to be punished every single time they coup another country, invade another country, force neoliberalism in another country. They would be pointing to their massive racially incarcerated prison population and being like, please sanction us right now. Force us to do something about this. Please ban us from this tournament. Please make us feel the burden and the real consequences of this. As that author so succinctly put it in regards to Russia. You're not going to hear any calls for any of that because at the end of the day, they didn't actually believe in any of this sincerely. All they believe in is, just attacking the enemies of Western imperialism with whatever happens to be convenient for them in the moment. And in the case of Qatar, it's not even that. In the case of Qatar, Qatar is great for Western imperialism. Qatar exists as a US proxy, but they would never call to boycott or attack the US over that. The US as the ultimate, the ultimate fucking boss of these Gulf states, they would never, ever target it for that reason or for any of the other reasons that I went over. The reason that they're so readily able to attack Qatar is because at the end of the day, Qatar is a country of brown people. It's obviously an awful monarchy, an awful repressive monarchy that just massively exploits foreign workers as slaves too. But they don't care about that. What they care about is that it does all those things while being brown, while being Muslim. Have it do all of those things while being Christian and white, and suddenly the concern would evaporate. When the fucking idiotic FIFA chief the other day, I think it was today actually, said that the West is being hypocritical and racist, he wasn't wrong. They are. But using that as a defense of Qatar is obviously dumb, because Qatar is bad whether they are...
White rights, of course.
Whether they're hypocritical and racist or not. And he's just bringing it up for the wrong reasons, which is basically to defend the Qatari state giving him and his buddies a big bribe to hold the World Cup. But all these other people who are claiming to give a shit about this because of human rights or anything like that, they clearly don't, because they're never going to apply that standard to themselves. Westerners should not be allowed to speak on other countries, on human rights or anything like that, until they completely withdraw from interference in other countries, for one, and for two, pay trillions upon trillions of dollars in reparations to their colonies and their former colonies. And until they do that, they should really shut the fuck up. Or at the very least, apply the same standards to themselves.
There's no room? They can't come there?
Say, yeah, you should, let's advocate for a boycott of Qatar, and let's also advocate for a boycott of the US in 2026. Do that at least, and I can respect you. But they're not going to, because it's not what it's about for them. What it's about for them is Western supremacy. What it's about for them is just racism and feeling better about themselves. Advocating for Western imperialism / being a racist piece of shit who just wants to performatively point out atrocities in other countries while ignoring all of their own. The biggest possible exercise in hypocrisy you could ever see. And that argument is always whataboutism. The argument here isn't that Qatar isn't bad because the US is also bad. Though the US is so much worse than Qatar that really even talking about them in the same breath like that is nonsensical. What the argument is that it makes no fucking sense for you to be so obsessed with Qatar when you live in the USA. It's like living on the fucking Death Star and talking about anyone else being bad. It's fucking insanely terrible that Americans are just so completely non-cognizant of how ridiculous they are. The point is that the argument here isn't that Qatar isn't bad because the US is also bad, or that Russia isn't bad because the US is also bad, or that Russia and Qatar shouldn't be boycotted or whatever. The argument here is that if you are applying those standards to those countries, you should apply them to yourself 10 times more, because your countries are far worse, yet you don't. And that right there proves that you don't actually give a shit about any of this. It's that simple. Look at this post. This is a perfect, absolutely perfect example of exactly what I'm talking about here. This post right here. The fact that FIFA had two options with the United States or Qatar to host the World Cup and chose one of the worst countries in terms of human rights and that they use slaves for hard labor means how fucked up the world is. They had two options with the United States and Qatar. Both of those options are fucking awful and would merit a massive boycott, and should never, ever in a million years have been seriously considered to host a major international sporting event, because they are both awful, disgusting, human rights abusing pieces of shit. So the US obviously on a far greater scale. Yet for this person, that's not how it works. They should have gone with the United States, because the United States is a perfect, great country. Only those bad Eastern countries should be boycotted and shouldn't have the right to host these international events, though they do awful things. It only applies to the Arab Muslims, not to us. You could literally just look at the fucking Iraq war, and the Iraq war alone is infinitely worse than everything that the Qatari oppressive, disgusting monarchy has done during the entirety of its existence, all combined. Yet these people somehow don't put two and two together, especially since the United States is literally what props up Qatar, because it wants its oil, and that's all it cares about. It doesn't care about human rights. All it cares about is fucking profit. The cognitive dissonance needed to say something like this. They shouldn't host it in the country that violates human rights. They should have hosted it in the USA. We could have built a bunch of great football stadiums on the Death Star. Darth Vader could have attended. And they have one response to pointing this out about them, and it's always, whataboutism? Whataboutism, using the whataboutism. If I use the magic word, I'll never have to actually deal with the fact that my purported principles are completely dishonest bullshit that are just used to legitimize my country's abominable, disgusting, destructive imperialism the world over. Ha ha ha, magic word. That's all it is. Why are you calling this out when you are far worse is a completely valid response. Why are you applying this standard to another country when you're not applying it to yourself when you do far worse? That is a completely valid response. Because what we're talking about here, it's not like, is the first thing bad? It's what motivates these people. Why do they do this? Changing the topic here from, okay, let's ask the question of, why are these people so hypocritical? Why are they so inconsistent with their purported principles? Why don't they apply their own standards to themselves? They see that and they change the topic to, that's whataboutism, dude. You're literally saying that Qatar isn't bad. You're literally saying that Russia isn't bad. You're mentioning the USA as a deflection. Whataboutism. That's ironically whataboutism, because their response isn't to actually directly address the argument, which is a question about, why are these people just lying about what they believe? Why don't they actually care about it for real? Why don't they apply their own standards to themselves? And changing it to, but Qatar is bad and Russia is bad. That's their own fucking supposed logical fallacy that they're employing against the argument. They're just changing the topic to something else so they don't have to actually address the simple fact they are massive hypocrites who don't actually believe in any of the things that they claim to believe in, and who just want to conveniently use anything bad about their geopolitical enemies as a cudgel, specifically against them, while ignoring themselves doing far worse things. And, if we apply the same standards to them, man, if we applied like the standards of sanctions, boycotts and shit that the USA and its supporters always want to apply to every other current country, the USA, there would be 0 countries trading with the USA. It would be completely cut off from the rest of the world. We would build a fucking wall around the country to make sure they can't fucking get out. So for those people who live in that fucking country, the worst of them all, that just constantly advocate for sanctions and boycotts and bans, etc., of stuff related to other countries, and never applying it to themselves, you know exactly where they're coming from with that. Because they want to advance their own country's imperialist, genocidal stranglehold on the rest of the world, and that's all there is to it.